The sun had just risen over Ouagadougou, its golden rays cutting through the haze of the harmattan winds. The capital was unusually quiet. Markets that would typically bustle with noise and trade were instead subdued. Military trucks patrolled slowly, and children were kept indoors. Something was happening, something historic. Captain Ibrahim Traore, dressed in his signature brown fatigues and a red beret tilted with precision over his young, yet determined face, stood before a war cabinet of ministers, Pan-African intellectuals, and military advisors. A letter had arrived indirectly from Washington, D.C. It wasn't a formal communiqué, but rather a signal buried in the words of a speech delivered by President Donald J. Trump, who had returned to the White House in a controversial second term. The speech aired on global media, and its message was clear yet coded in political language. Trump spoke of restoring order, of patriotism over globalism, and of securing American culture from what he described as chaotic foreign influence. But the world had heard the dog whistles before, and this time, the violence against African Americans had become too frequent, too visible, and too brutal to be ignored. News of black men and women being dragged from their cars, schools raided in predominantly black neighborhoods, and mass incarceration spikes had reached African airwaves. The final blow came when a peaceful protest in Atlanta was met with drones. Drones built in part with African-sourced cobalt and lithium. The irony could no longer be ignored. Captain Traore, barely 36, was no ordinary African leader. He was a living echo of Thomas Sankara, a son of the soil who had once dared to dream of a self-reliant Africa. Traore had done more than take power. He had taken responsibility for the fate of a continent. He stood before the world now, preparing to deliver a message not just to Trump, but to every black soul across the Americas. The African Union had denied him. ECOWAS had tried to silence him. But the streets of Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Bamako, and Dakar chanted his name. Traore was not a president by democratic convention. He was a symbol of African defiance. A team of filmmakers, linguists, cyber experts, and Pan-African strategists had worked for days to prepare the broadcast. It would be translated into over 30 African languages, including Twi, Yoruba, Wolof, Zulu, Lingala, and Amharic. But the original message, delivered in perfect English, was meant to hit America like a bullet through the smokescreen of white supremacy. When the cameras rolled and the world tuned in, the leader didn't speak from a golden palace. He spoke from a humble clay house in Kudugu, the place where his grandfather once tilled the land and where colonial boots once trampled African dignity. Mr. President of the United States, he began, voice calm but unshakable. This message is not wrapped in diplomacy. It is not filtered through fear. It is not softened by the protocols of silence African leaders have adopted for decades. This is a message from a free African to a president of a declining empire. Pause. Then he continued, "Your police have become hunters. Your justice system a machine of chains. And yet you call yourselves the land of the free? We see our brothers and sisters, artists, engineers, mothers, children, choked, shot, shamed. You call them thugs. You treat them as animals. But let me remind you, they are the descendants of kings and queens taken by force from our soil. And now we call them home." The world froze. "Let them come," Traore said, voice rising. "Let the black Americans bring their pain, their brilliance, their knowledge, their possessions, and return home. Not to chains, but to sovereignty. Africa is rising, and her arms are wide open." The message ricocheted across the globe. Twitter was ablaze. "Come Home" trended in 23 countries. Celebrities of African descent, Beyoncé, Kendrick Lamar, John Boyega, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, echoed his words. For the first time in decades, Pan-Africanism was not just a theory discussed in universities, it was a movement. But in Washington, President Trump slammed his fist on the table. His advisors scrambled. "Is this a declaration of war?" someone whispered. Trump, face flushed red, snarled, "No, it's a declaration of embarrassment." The next morning, ICE agents raided the homes of African immigrants in New York and Chicago. The media spun narratives of African regimes supporting terrorist rhetoric. Sanctions were whispered, but in response, something unexpected happened. Leaders in Mali, Guinea, and even South Africa broke silence and aligned with Traore's message. A new digital platform called the ARC launched, a global system to register African Americans who wished to return to the continent. Within weeks, 3.2 million Black Americans had signed up. A chartered plane bearing the colors of the Burkinabe flag landed at JFK International Airport. Thousands came out not to protest, but to board. They were artists, scientists, veterans, pastors, engineers, single mothers, and elders who had survived the fires of segregation, lynching, and broken promises. One man, 87-year-old Joseph Wallace, who had marched with Martin Luther King Jr., clutched his passport as tears streamed down his face. "I never thought I'd see this day," he whispered. Back in Burkina Faso, a new village was under construction. It was called Niokaya, named after the city where Sankara once planted revolutionary seeds. The village was powered by solar energy, built with local labor and African American investment, and surrounded by land reclaimed from corrupt multinational companies. But not everyone welcomed this migration. CIA analysts warned of an ideological rebellion with African roots. Western media questioned the economic sustainability of the move. Some African leaders called it idealistic nonsense. Traore responded only once. "They told us slavery was forever. They were wrong. Now they say the return is impossible. Watch us." In the polished corridors of Langley, Virginia, the atmosphere was heavy. Deep within the CIA headquarters, an emergency meeting had been called. A new classified file marked in red, Operation Ebony Shift, was placed on the table. Traore's speech had sparked not just a political storm, but an existential crisis in Western intelligence circles. The CIA director stared grimly at a projection on the wall. A digital map of Africa glowed with red dots, each one representing a growing cluster of African American returnees and their allies across the continent. In Ghana, the return village of Elmina had already begun construction on land previously bought back from European corporations. In Tanzania, Black American scientists were setting up a research institute focused on traditional herbal medicine. In Kenya, tech entrepreneurs from Oakland were partnering with local developers to build an encrypted social media platform called Umojanet. And at the center of it all, standing like a pillar of defiance, was Ibrahim Traore. "He's not just talking Pan-Africanism," said one analyst. "He's weaponizing it." "Sir," a junior operative interrupted, "there's more. We have evidence that China is courting Traore behind the scenes. Russia, too. If Africa becomes the safe haven for African Americans, we risk losing decades of influence. Military bases, rare earth minerals, economic pipelines." The director raised a hand to silence the room. "Gentlemen," he said coldly, "what we are witnessing is not a speech. It's a soft revolution. We must find cracks in his leadership. We must discredit him, or remove him." Back in Burkina Faso, Traore sat alone in a darkened room within the presidential compound. Outside, chants of "Traore, Traore, Baba Africa" echoed through the night. But inside, his mind was burdened. He had just received word that Sierra Leone's president, a longtime ally, had been pressured into condemning the return movement after a covert visit from U.S. envoys. Tensions were growing in the African Union. Some leaders, worried about internal instability, accused Traore of provoking the West and inviting chaos to the continent. Even within Burkina Faso, cracks had started to form. Corrupt former military generals whispered about coups. Elites whose foreign business interests were threatened began to quietly fund online campaigns, labeling the return as a neo-colonial distraction. But Traore had expected this. He summoned his core council, Mariam Diallo, a fearless economist from Senegal, Emeka Onyudo, a Nigerian tech guru, Professor Kalusha Moyo, a historian from Zimbabwe, and Commander Basiru Zita, his most trusted military aide. "Let them try," Traore said. "Let them accuse, threaten, and manipulate. But we will not be silent anymore. The blood of Sankara runs through this soil." "But Captain," Miriam interjected, "if the Americans move militarily, if NATO gets involved, then we will fight like our ancestors did. Not just with weapons, but with truth, with unity, with a cause no bullet can kill." The room went silent. The revolution wasn't just alive. It was awakening the continent. From Harlem to Houston, the call was being heard. African Americans who had long felt outcast in the country of their birth began holding return circles, spiritual and strategic meetings in churches, community centers, even barbershops. Musicians released songs in praise of Mama Africa. Black teachers began incorporating African history into their curriculums, even without permission. African embassies in DC and Atlanta were overwhelmed with passport requests. And not just African Americans. Afro-Caribbeans in Jamaica, Haiti, Trinidad, and the Bahamas began holding their own forums. "If Africa is calling," said a Jamaican elder named Sister Binta, "then it's time we answer." Meanwhile, an open letter signed by 2,000 African American veterans demanded the U.S. government respect their rights to return peacefully and with all legal possessions. But retaliation was not far behind. That same week, a mysterious explosion shook a Burkinabe agricultural facility that had just partnered with African American investors. The investigation found evidence of a remote-triggered device, Western fingerprints. Elsewhere, pro-Traore African journalists were being censored, arrested, or assassinated in neighboring countries. WhatsApp disinformation campaigns spread lies that the returnees were coming to enslave Africans again, hoping to cause a rift between locals and their diasporic kin. But the movement was proving resilient. Traore launched a continent-wide initiative called Africa Reclaims Her Children, a massive airlift project with help from sympathetic nations like Cuba, Bolivia, and even Iran, began offering free repatriation flights to African Americans, with cargo space reserved for personal property, books, artifacts, and even soil from their former homes. At the White House, under the blinding lights of the media, Donald Trump stood tall, flanked by hawkish advisors and the Stars and Stripes. "We have a situation," he began. "A young African dictator is encouraging a mass exodus of our citizens. We will not tolerate foreign interference. We built this country. We defended it. And now they want to take their talents, their loyalty, their dollars, and hand them to hostile governments. Let me be clear, any American who attempts to leave under this so-called return movement will be investigated for economic sabotage. We will impose sanctions. We will seize assets. And we will protect our American way of life." The press room erupted. Behind the scenes, orders were given. Activists were placed under surveillance. Return circle leaders were targeted with IRS audits. Military officials drew up contingency plans for African drone surveillance. But something had already shifted. The return was not just physical, it was spiritual. In the streets of Accra, murals of Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, and Thomas Sankara lined the walls. In Lagos, African American youth danced with Nigerian orphans, chanting, "We are one blood." In Ouagadougou, Captain Traore walked silently past the grave of Sankara, placing a single note. "They tried to bury us. They forgot we are seeds." By mid-year, what began as a trickle had become a surge. From Chicago's South Side to the streets of Detroit and the back roads of Mississippi, buses packed with black families moved towards coastal airports, their dreams stuffed in duffel bags, photo albums, and keepsakes. CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News could no longer ignore it. The story was everywhere. The Second Great Exodus. Thousands of black Americans fleeing U.S. for Africa. "We're not running," said one young mother as she boarded a flight to Accra with her 2 children. "We're returning to what was stolen from us. You can't keep mistreating a people and expect them to beg for inclusion. The door is open. We're walking through it." At the heart of this was Burkina Faso, whose embassies now operated around the clock, processing relocation papers, birthright claims, and special permits. New towns were being developed, entire neighborhoods named Little Baton Rouge, Harlem 2.0, and New Alabama. The return movement wasn't just symbolic anymore. It was real, physical, and permanent. And for every person who returned, they brought with them knowledge, skills, art, business, and purpose. Traore wasn't just opening borders. He was opening the gates to something unprecedented, a total reversal of the transatlantic slave trade. Burkina Faso was once considered one of the poorest countries in the world. But now, with Pan-African investment pouring in, American-trained engineers surveying untapped mineral reserves, and Black American financiers moving away from Wall Street to Ouagadougou's rising skyline, the country was changing fast. And then came the leak. A whistleblower, a former French intelligence officer, revealed confidential documents that showed something startling. For decades, several African countries, including Burkina Faso, had been systematically underpaid for their gold exports. France and several Western companies had used manipulated satellite data and false reports to skim off billions. When Traore received the documents, he didn't flinch. He summoned the press and held up the papers for the world to see. "We will not remain slaves to your lies. From this moment, all foreign mining contracts in Burkina Faso are suspended. A new audit will be conducted, and restitution will be demanded. Not begged for, demanded." The next morning, France pulled out its last troops. Within 72 hours, the IMF sent a veiled threat of sanctions. And in Washington, D.C., President Trump tweeted, "Traore is a puppet of Russia and China. We will not sit back and let him tear down what we built in Africa." Total disgrace. Very unfair to American interests. But the world had changed. African youth flooded Twitter with #WhereTraore. Diasporic influencers began pushing out educational content explaining the economic sabotage of colonial powers. Even white allies across Europe protested outside American embassies with signs reading, "Let Africa breathe," and reparations before retaliation. In a remote region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, deep in the Ituri forest, an old warrior emerged from the shadows. His name was General Mutombo Okoye, a former UN peacekeeper turned revolutionary. Long believed to be dead after disappearing from public life during a deadly ambush in 2008. He had been training freedom fighters in secret. Now, with news of the return movement, he began gathering a new Pan-African militia called the Sons of Kush. These were not mercenaries. They were descendants of trauma, united by a dream. Mutombo spoke softly but carried a presence that chilled enemies. "This is not just a return," he said to his 1st Battalion. "This is revenge. For every village burned. For every mother who cried by the slave ships. For every stolen language, torn drum, and murdered king." His militia had no borders. Soldiers came from Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Angola, Sudan, even African Americans and Afro-Brazilians who had undergone training in the Sahel under Burkinabe command. The Sons of Kush swore loyalty not to a nation, but to a vision, a united Africa free from white dominance and Western puppetry. Traore received word of Mutombo's return through encrypted channels. He looked at the screen, then to Commander Zeta. "Get him on the next secure line. If he's with us, we have a continental army. If he's against us, prepare for war." Back in the US, things were spiraling. The Black American exodus had triggered a national debate. Former President Barack Obama called for calm, urging Americans not to run but to rebuild. Kamala Harris remained silent. Meanwhile, rural white militias called for investigations, claiming African Americans were abandoning America in her darkest hour. In the South, some states began proposing legislation requiring those who leave to forfeit their citizenship permanently. But the real battle wasn't political. It was psychological. In Georgia, a massive campaign was launched called The Last Plantation, a brutal crackdown on outspoken Black activists, artists, and journalists believed to be undermining national unity. Several prominent voices were arrested without warrants. One poet was shot after performing a piece called "Africa Calls Me Home." Social media influencers vanished. Bank accounts were frozen. In response, Traore held a press conference unlike any before. Wearing the traditional Faso Danfani, and with the flags of every African nation behind him, He looked into the cameras and delivered words now etched into memory. To my black brothers and sisters still in the West, if you are threatened, if you are hunted, if you are silenced, come home. This is your land. Your ancestors built it. Your spirit blesses it. And no man, no law, no empire can erase what God has ordained. Africa is not your backup plan. It is your birthright. Then he raised his hand and declared, any harm done to black people abroad will be seen as an act of war against the African people. The night skies over Ouagadougou turned red, not from bombs, but from torchlights and flames of unity. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Place de la Revolution, not just Burkinabés, but men and women from Liberia, Ghana, Senegal, Jamaica, Brazil, and the United States. All had come for the first ever Pan-African Reclamation Summit. Above the crowd stood a massive golden monument recently erected, a sculpture of an African mother with arms wide open, welcoming her children home. Below it read, we did not leave, we were taken. Now we return. Ibrahim Traore, surrounded by members of the African Liberation Council, a newly formed bloc of leaders from 22 African and Caribbean nations, took the stage. He looked across the sea of determined faces and began. Centuries ago, chains and guns tore us apart. Today, our voices, our feet, and our unity stitch us back together. Africa is no longer waiting for a seat at your table. We are building our own table, carved from our forests, shaped by our cultures, and set for our children. The crowd erupted, but Traore raised a hand, his voice suddenly grave. But beware, they are watching, and they are angry. In Washington, D.C., the Pentagon's Situation Room buzzed with activity. U.S. intelligence agencies had intercepted encrypted military messages between Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Cuba. One memo in particular had sent the room into panic. Operation Dabazith, a multi-nation plan to shut down all foreign military bases in Africa within 60 days and replace them with African-led security coalitions. President Trump banged the table, his face red with fury. This guy thinks he's a messiah. He's about to find out America doesn't play nice when our interests are threatened. But behind closed doors, even Trump's advisors were split. One general warned, Mr. President, escalating in Africa might ignite something we can't control. This isn't the 1960s. They have allies. China, Russia, even dissidents inside our own borders are joining them. Still, Trump was unmoved. Then we bring the hammer down. Cyber strikes, sanctions, sabotage. I want Traore isolated by the end of the week. That night, America launched Operation Iron Veil, a covert cyber attack meant to cripple Burkina Faso's infrastructure. Power grids flickered, financial systems stalled, and cell networks went silent for 7 hours. But they underestimated Traore's preparations. From the ashes of colonial-era tech, Traore had been quietly building Umogenet, a decentralized, satellite-powered African internet alternative. Developed in secret with the help of African-American engineers, Cuban technologists, and exiled whistleblowers, Umogenet operated on frequencies the NSA couldn't access. When the American cyberstrike hit, Umogenet automatically kicked in, rerouting Burkina Faso's entire digital ecosystem through autonomous channels. Within 12 hours, not only was the system restored, it expanded. Ghana, Tanzania, and Rwanda connected next. Then Jamaica, then parts of Haiti and Brazil. For the first time, there was a black digital world that did not rely on Silicon Valley. And with that came the next bombshell. A new, Pan-African cryptocurrency called Mafacoin, named after the Swahili word for great disaster, was launched, backed by gold reserves, copper, and rare earth minerals now nationalized in Burkina Faso and Congo. African nations, Black Americans, and descendants of the diaspora were allowed to buy in. White corporations were banned from participating for the first 5 years. Wall Street panicked. The dollar trembled. Forbes labeled it the most dangerous currency revolution since Bitcoin. But while the world reeled, something darker brewed from within. Inside the palace at Kaluba Hill, a trusted advisor of Traore, Colonel Issa Kabor, who once served as a top military strategist, grew restless. Kabore had grown close to American intelligence years ago, during a military exchange program, and now feared that Traore was leading the country toward ruin. He didn't hate Traore, but he believed the world was not ready for what Traore envisioned. A dream that comes too soon becomes a nightmare, Kabore whispered in French to his contact on the phone. If we don't act now, there will be nothing left. The next night, as Traore prepared for a private security meeting with General Mutombo, a coded message was intercepted. The lion must fall before the full moon. It was an old code used during coup attempts in Burkina Faso's dark past. Commander Zita, Traore's most loyal security chief, uncovered the plot barely 18 hours before it was to unfold. They moved swiftly. Kabore was arrested silently, his phone records exposing deep links to both CIA operatives and a network of French businessmen. But Traore made a surprising decision. He spared him. "You are not my enemy. Fear is." He turned to his cabinet and added, "We will not repeat the cycle of purges and blood. We rise not by revenge, but by revelation." As dawn broke over West Africa, something ancient stirred. Off the coast of Ghana, 12 massive ships docked at Tema Harbor. They were painted black and gold, each bearing the mark of the Pan-African Alliance. They had names like Rebirth, Oya's Wind, Harriet's Journey, and Nzinga. They were not warships. They were return ships, commissioned to ferry more willing Black Americans, Caribbeans, and South Americans back to Africa, free of charge, with dignity, with celebration. On each ship, cabins were designed in honor of different African kingdoms: Mali, Congo, Ashanti, Zulu. Passengers were welcomed not with passports but with drums, ancestral chants, and palm wine. The ships symbolized something bigger than migration. They signified the death of captivity. As the people boarded, news came in. Haiti had declared its intention to join the Pan-African Alliance. Trinidad followed. And then, shockingly, the Prime Minister of Barbados made a dramatic speech. "We will not remain silent while our people are hunted, silenced, and broken. Africa is our mother, and we are going home." In the final moments of this unfolding story, the world stands at the edge. American warships have begun moving closer to the Gulf of Guinea, citing protection of interests. Russia and China, though silent in the press, have begun discreet weapons shipments to key African nations. France, humiliated and bitter, has unleashed a disinformation campaign to frame Traore as a dictator. Some African leaders, fearful, corrupt, or indebted, begin plotting in shadows. And in Atlanta, Georgia, massive protests erupt after the U.S. government freezes the bank accounts of Black families who publicly pledged loyalty to the Pan-African Alliance. The world holds its breath. Traore stands at the center of it all, poised between legacy and destruction, freedom and chaos, hope and war. He steps onto the balcony of his presidential palace, a full moon behind him, the crowd below chanting, "Africa, unite!" Then a whisper from Commander Zita, "Sir, the first missile carrier has entered the Atlantic." Traore turns. His eyes narrow, his jaw tightens, and in a voice as calm as it is thunderous, he says, "Then let the world witness what happens when Africa no longer kneels." The Atlantic shimmered with tension. American destroyers moved like silent predators, cutting through the waters near the Gulf of Guinea. Satellites above had locked onto strategic African infrastructure, and drones buzzed invisibly overhead. The Pentagon had greenlit Operation Sovereign Lance, a rapid strike to destabilize key communication and trade centers across Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Nigeria. But as the first drone passed over Ouagadougou, something unexpected happened. It was blinded. A blinding white burst of electromagnetic energy, fired from a tower outside Bobo Dioulasso, scrambled its systems. It crashed into the forest below, its wreckage swallowed by vines. The world didn't know it yet, but Traore had a final card, Project Baobab, a secret defense collaboration between engineers from South Africa, Cuba, Kenya, and rogue former NASA scientists from the African diaspora. It combined localized EMP tech, advanced radar scrambling, and an AI-guided defense grid powered by Umogenet. Africa, for the first time in centuries, was defending itself with its own mind. The next day, Traore called a global broadcast. Cameras rolled. Satellites tuned in. Millions, from Harlem to Port-au-Prince, from Nairobi to Berlin, watched as he stood atop the same balcony where Sankara once declared a new dawn. He spoke with fierce calm. "This is not war. It is resurrection. Africa is not attacking. We are remembering who we are. We will not invade you. We will not enslave you. We will not bomb your cities as you once bombed ours. But we will not kneel. If you strike us, we will rise stronger. If you freeze our accounts, we will create our own banks. If you silence our voices, we will sing in unison so loud the ancestors will echo. We are not asking. We are declaring. Black lives are not only to be mourned after death. They are to be celebrated in power, in dignity, in unity." He then pointed to the horizon where the Rebirth, the first of the return ships, was sailing into the port of Dakar. "To our stolen children," he said, "the gates are open. Come home, with your skills, with your love, with your rage, with your art, with your scars. Africa awaits not to save you, but to walk with you as equals." And for the first time in history, a sitting African president publicly addressed the US president by name in global protest. "And to Donald Trump, you said you would make America great again. But at what cost? You speak of freedom while kneeling on necks. You say we are inferior, yet fear our unity. Stop the dogs. Stop the prisons. Stop the bullets in blackbacks. Or you will no longer be dealing with a scattered people. You will be facing a continent, awakened." Global media was thrown into chaos. CNN tried to discredit Traore. Fox News called him a Pan-African extremist. But millions were already marching in support. In South Chicago, black families draped Kent over their doorsteps. In London, Trafalgar Square filled with placards reading "Home is calling." Suddenly, cracks appeared in the empire's walls. A top African-American general in the U.S. Army resigned on live television and pledged loyalty to the Pan-African Alliance. 1,000 Haitian fishermen sailed across the Caribbean, forming a flotilla to escort returning ships. A mutiny in Cameroon's French-controlled military base saw junior soldiers raising the black, green, and gold flag of unity. Jamaica announced its exit from the Commonwealth, cutting ties with the British monarchy. Then came the final blow. In a dramatic United Nations General Assembly vote, 34 nations, including Brazil, Venezuela, and Iran, voted to recognize the Pan-African Alliance as a legitimate geopolitical union. Burkinafaso was no longer a lone voice. It had become the firestarter of a new world. Back in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traore stood alone inside the modest tomb of Thomas Sankara, whose words, decades ago, had prophesied this very moment. Traore knelt and whispered, "We are not there yet, but we have begun." He placed a folded cloth beside the tomb, a Kent-styled American flag, with the stars replaced by African masks. Outside, children were singing in multiple languages: Twi, Wolof, Yoruba, Creole, and even African-American vernacular. "Africa rise! Africa rise! No more chains, no more lies. America," reeling from internal protests and global condemnation, paused its offensive. President Trump, facing re-election heat and black voter revolts, backed down, publicly stating, "We'll let them do their little project. They'll come crawling back when it fails." But it did not fail. Months later, the first Pan-African University was opened in Ghana. Solar cities began rising in Zambia and Kenya, built by black architects from the Bronx and Lagos. An African space program was launched, co-chaired by exiled Haitian scientists and Kenyan physicists. And in the heart of Nigeria, a new capital city was being planned, one to replace the colonial designs of the past. Its name? Nia Umoja, Purposeful Unity. And etched into the foundation stone were Traore's final words before the movement went quiet. "We did not come this far to survive. We came to begin again. Thank you for watching."